Le Nissan Kick-Play 2025 a beaucoup de plus. Apple CarPlay intégré pour jouer vos tunes préférées, des fonctions avancées de sécurité, un rendement énergétique remarquable, puis même la petite odeur de char neuf qu'on aime tant. Tout ça en plus pour moins. Le Nissan Kick Play 2025 est le véhicule neuf le plus abordable au Québec. Achetez-le à partir de seulement 22 774 $, incluant un rabais à l'achat comptant de 2 600 $. Profitez de cette offre avantageuse chez votre concessionnaire dès maintenant. Jusqu'au 2 mars, des conditions s'appliquent. Détails chez Nissan.
You ever get pulled over? You ever get stopped on the street? Or you ever get a knock at the door from the police? What are your rights and responsibilities? What should you do if you have to interact with the police? To answer those questions, Ari Goldkind joins me on the line, criminal lawyer and legal expert. Ari, thanks so much for coming on the show.
My pleasure, Elias. Anytime.
I just want to put it in the perspective. The reason I wanted to do this topic and talk to you about it is because I feel like everything I know about this subject is actually from a U.S. perspective, from U.S. TV or social media of some like Constitution protector in the U.S. that's adamant about it. But I don't have the Canadian perspective. So I want to talk about this. And I mentioned three things off the top: the pulled over situation, the on the street, the knock at the door at your house. Can we cover those all in one shot, or should we go through each one separately?
Well, they're all worth discussing separately, Elias.
Okay.
But let me be clear on something here. The U.S. example, obviously right now, we're in the heat of a lot of, I would say, intensity in the States when it comes to policing. However, the questions that you're asking me go back decades and lots of jurisprudence, and there's really three important points. And you actually raised them. When cops come to your door at your house, that's one regime. If you're walking down the street, sort of just on the street, walking, minding your own business, and cops come up to you and want to have a chat with you, that's a different regime. If, however, and you mentioned this, so you really hit the three areas on the head, Elias, the cops pull you over while you're driving. That's a whole other regime, and interestingly, a very different regime than walking down the street. So if you want, we can go into them together or separate. You lead the way.
Let's do it separate, okay? So let's start off with, what we're seeing nowadays. People that are protesting, let's say, or someone who's on the street walking to a protest or walking home, gets stopped on the street. The cops want your ID. What do you have to give them? What questions do you have to answer?
All right. So first of all, and this is important, if you're walking down the street, and it doesn't matter if you're at a protest or not, let's assume you're walking down the street and you're not suspected of any crime. That's the term that has been used throughout Canada, sort of street check or carding. You're under no obligation. And this is something that a lot of Canadians don't know, Elias, and let me just back it up because this has got to make sense to people who aren't lawyers. Mm-hmm. People, when cops come up to you, the last thing you're thinking, or at least 98% of people are thinking, is to tell the cops to go away, or, you're not talking, or you're not cooperating, right? Because you see people in uniform, and most Canadians either have respect for the uniform or fear for the uniform. But if you're not suspected of any crime, and you're not driving a car, you simply can say to police officers, am I free to go? You don't have to answer any questions. You don't have to help them with anything. And, Elias, you do not even have to tell them your name. This is a very heavily litigated area.
Wow. And
the only time you would get in trouble, and I'll actually stop my answer here on the street subject to your questions, is don't give them false information. In other words, if you want to blow them off or you don't like the fact that cops are stopping you, you can't get in trouble for saying, I'm not giving you my name. But when can you get arrested is if Ari Goldkind got stopped while walking down the street, was asked his name, and said, my name is Elias Makos. Mm-hmm. Then I can be arrested.
So, Ari, you don't want to answer the questions. You say, am I free to go? If they say, no, you have to stay here, that changes everything, does it?
That is correct. That changes everything. And let's give the benefit of the doubt. They suspect that Elias Makos has committed a crime. Now, remember, this is about suspecting that you've committed a crime or they actually see you committing a crime. This is not about you being a witness or they want to get you to talk about somebody else. Then if you're not free to go or you're not under arrest, because there's a difference between being under arrest and actually arrested versus being detained, while they try and figure out if Elias Makos has done something bad. But if you're not free to go, the same answer applies. And again, we're going to change all of this when it comes to getting pulled over in a car. That's a different fish. Mm-hmm. But you're still under no obligation to cooperate, to answer questions, to give your name, to do anything. The key here, though, Elias, is that there's a big gap here. A lot of lawyers and civil liberties groups and Crown attorneys will say, well, you have all of these rights and charter rights and this, that, and the other, right? But when you're by yourself and you're dealing with 2 or 3 officers surrounding you, the key really, and I've seen this for 20 years, is just be polite. Uh-huh. And I know people say, well, why should you be polite when there's no business for pulling you over or detaining you? Because you're not going to gain anything the other way. You want to leave the situation healthy, sane. You don't want to end up on a YouTube video like that chief that we see the 11 minutes of YouTube today. Yeah. So the bottom line is, when you're told you're not free to go or you're detained, they can pat you down to make sure you don't have any weapons, but you do not have to help them investigate you.
Gotcha. At your door, they come to your door, they knock. And where is there differences there?
Yeah, big differences. So first of all, the cliche, which will now, because we're 2020 and living in a different world, a woman's home is her castle. Mm-hmm. So we now live in a world that has not changed, because we've lived in a world that's changing so much now with all of the politics. But the home is literally the castle. So unless they're invited in by the owner or by somebody there with some color of right to do it, I've seen cases where it's a cleaning lady, for example, they cannot come into your home without a warrant. Now, people say, hold on, I've watched Cops and I've watched Law and Order, and cops go blazing in. There's 2 or 3 situations where they can do it. Most of your audience will know what a search warrant is. There are search warrants where they knock and say, sir, here's the warrant, blah, blah, blah. There are other circumstances, and this is a big issue in the States right now, where it's a no-knock warrant, where they think there's drugs in the home or guns. If they think there's drugs in the home, Elias, and they knock on the door and say, police here with a search warrant, how fast are you making a beeline to the toilet to flush it down? Mm-hmm. So there are what's called warrants where they can force entry in. The other, and this is actually a very interesting one and much easier to wrap your head around, is if the police get, for example, and this is just an example, a 911 call where a husband is beating his wife inside the home. There's no warrant there, Elias. There's no necessarily gentleness. If they believe somebody in the home is in serious danger of personal injury and those sort of things, not something trifling, they're coming in, and the law allows it. It's called exigent circumstances.
Ari, we're going to table the discussion on the cars for another day because we won't have the time to do it properly. So I'll just ask you one more question about at the home. Before, you had mentioned, being polite. When it comes to the home, be polite, but would you advise someone to never, ever let the police in your house unless they've got that warrant?
Well, here's what I'd say in 30 seconds or less. If you've called the police because there's a problem with your neighbor or there's a problem you need their help with, I don't buy this whole idea that you need to see the police as the enemy. I think that's a smear on police that has no basis in fact. However, if they're there because the neighbor has called on you or they're investigating a crime or a complaint about you, I can't imagine why you'd ever invite officers into your home for tea.
And what about asking, I need my attorney, I want to speak to an attorney. When do you do that if it's on the street?
You can only really exercise that right when the officers detain you or arrest you. Any officer has a color of right to come to your door and ask you questions and talk to you. That is absolutely settled law. It's up to you whether you want to cooperate or not, but there's no right triggered to a lawyer unless you're detained or arrested. Now, you can go into your house and close the door and say, I'm calling a lawyer, but the cops have that charter right triggered once you're essentially not free to go. And it doesn't just have to be physical, Elias. They don't have to touch Elias and grab his hand and say you're not free. Mm-hmm. You could be psychologically detained where I'm probably not going to make a beeline here without there being big trouble.
Ari, thanks so much for coming on the show, and we'll have you back real soon for the behind the wheel segment of this.
No problem.
That's Ari Goldkind, criminal lawyer, legal expert.